Welcome to our primer class on the market validation funnel. Today we're going to talk about how can you market validate something before you build it. And we've built this market validation funnel that into a masterclass series, and this is just a little taste of what you can expect in the masterclass itself. So we're going to go over this. It's about 30 to 45 minutes, kind of give a high-level flyover of what is the market validation funnel. So first, a little introduction to me. My name is Josh Barker. I've built 13 startups, failed at 9 of them, so most of them. Learned a lot what not to do, and also in that process obviously learned some things that are good to do. And through that, I would say my career has been a sine wave, where you build these startups and you put a lot of time and energy into it, and then you kind of go back into this large company and you recuperate. And so I've always been an entrepreneur in one regard and then an intrapreneur in another, and so I've been able to learn innovation in a large company as well as innovation in a startup. And so what does that look like? I went out for a period of time to Silicon Valley. I co-founded a startup out there. Loved that experience because I was effectively the dumbest person in the room. And that was just amazing because I could walk in and just learn a ton of information from smart people. And learned how to build the right thing effectively out in Silicon Valley. So great experience out there. And now, today, I'm the CEO of City Innovations, so we're a venture studio in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So our mission is to flip the script of 9 out of 10 startups fail. How can we flip that script? How can we increase the number of successful startups? So as you're going through this, the question I'm going to ask you as you're thinking about different topics is, how many have built something new and brought it to market? And if you're watching this, the expectation is that you're an intrapreneur, you're an entrepreneur, you've tried to bring something to market, and there's a high probability that one of your ideas has failed. And it's nothing to do with it was a bad idea. A lot of it has to do with all of these types of reasons. So what you'll notice is that Forbes actually put out a 101 startup post-mortem report in which they asked startups, what is the reason why you failed? And you can see there's a variety of different reasons. And so at the top, it says no market need. It goes down to the bottom and it says ran out of cash, not the right team, got outcompeted, pricing cost issues. There's a whole plethora of different reasons why startups fail. And so what we realized at City, after looking at that data and kind of putting them into themes and buckets, we realized you could pretty much put almost all of them into the bucket of they failed to build the right thing fast enough. And so if you go down that list of no market need, that could be fit into they failed to build the right thing, right? Ran out of cash. Well, they failed to build it fast enough. And so if you start going through this list, you start to realize that the theme of all of these, if you group them all together, is they failed to build the right thing fast enough. So that begs the question, how do you build the right thing, right? And that's why we're here. We're going to talk about how to do that. And I always like to look at startups like this big success poster. We've seen those motivational posters where you've got this giant iceberg, right? And at the top it says success. And below the waterline you have persistence, dedication, hard work, all the struggles and all the different things. And that's so true of startups. And so oftentimes we have this view of the above the waterline of success being someone had an idea, something was built, everyone loved it, and then effectively a unicorn was built. And so for those that aren't familiar with the term unicorn, it's just a startup with over $1 billion valuation. So it's so easy for us to just see that tip of the iceberg and not realize all the things that were underneath it. So if you take a look at all the different things, someone had an idea, someone built it, and ended up no one used maybe the first version, third version, fourth version, and so they iterated. They had to iterate over and over and over until they finally found something that people thought was special enough to use, solved an aspirin problem, and then they iterated on that. And you can see that, there's numbers on the side that goes 1 through 100, and I would effectively say there's even more, but oftentimes we don't see under the waterline of all of that hard work and persistence of the startup not being a straight line to finding something, the right thing to build. Everyone effectively thinks that building startups is a straight line, right? So at the beginning, you've got this idea, and at the end you've got this viable venture, and all you need to do is put the perfect roadmap in place, and you're going to end up finding that. When really it's the furthest thing from the truth. Is at the bottom there's a quote here that says, if I build it, they will come, right? And it says every first-time founder. And also Field of Dreams, if you've seen that movie, of someone, he has this voice in his head saying, go out and build it, they will come. And he's talking about a baseball diamond in the middle of nowhere. And so that is a complete fallacy for startups of, if you build it, they won't come, right? They're not going to come. So it's nothing but a straight line when you're talking about a startup. So another way to look at it is most startups also have a set of chips when they start the startup. What that's resources, time, money. They have a specific set of resources, and a lot of people take all of their chips, or at least the majority of their chips, and then they take up one large bet and they go to market. And so, but that leaves very little room for error, right? It leaves very little room to say, what if you're wrong? What if you then have to pivot? And so a lot of entrepreneurs put all their chips in one area, when instead you should be dividing them out into much smaller pieces and chunks and saying, I'm going to take these much smaller bets, because that leaves a lot more room to understand how, if one fails, you just move on to the next thought and idea and pivot. And so the question is, how do you do that? And that's what we're leading up to with the market validation funnel. So going back to that straight line approach, if we were to actually use that same line analogy of what does it look like, it's actually more like a squiggly line, right? And so you've got this idea, and then you take bet number one, and it squiggles all over because you're pivoting and you're learning new information and you're trying to figure out what it is that customers want. So that's your first bet. It goes on, you maybe squiggle a little bit less, and you take your second bet. And every subsequent bet after that, the line gets straighter and straighter, because then you start to realize your true north, of the true direction that you need to take the startup to create a viable venture. As you're listening to this, one of the things that you'll realize is a lot of the core tenets and the core principles that we're going to talk about are rooted and based in these books. So the Lean Startup, the Startup Owner's Manual by Steve Blank, Eric Ries, all of their work, such good work. If you haven't read these books, I would highly encourage and recommend it, because it would add a lot of good context for this masterclass. Is it necessary? Absolutely not. We'll walk through those principles, but it's still very much a recommended good read. So with this, talking about, here's a summary of what these books kind of entail, is most entrepreneurs have this large bet, as we talked about. And so they have one room for build, measure, learn. So there's a build, measure, learn cycle that the books and the curriculum all talk about, of first you're going to build something, you're going to measure the results of that, measure how users are using the product, and then you're going to learn new information, and you're going to apply it to that new build cycle as you're going through a build, measure, learn cycle. So what instead, if you're only able to do that one time, effectively that doesn't mean you're learning very fast. So how can you learn faster? And the idea is you can have multiple iterations of this build, measure, learn, and multiple of them, right? So success is redefined as the number of learnings. How fast can you learn about your customers? So if you're talking about a startup, oftentimes people go, how can you measure success? And if a lag measure is always going to be revenue, right? Revenue is a great metric, but how can you measure something that's more of a lead metric, more of a metric that you can quantitatively measure progress and the number of learnings? So the faster you can learn about your customers, the more adept that you are pivoting in the correct direction more quickly. So one of the things about these books is they are wonderful books. On one hand, you've got Eric Ries, who is actually a student of Steve Blank. Eric Ries wrote this book called The Lean Startup. And so great book. One of the things about this book is he gives a lot of stories, as most great authors do. Highly recommend the book. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Steve Blank, who's a professor. And so he takes a very educational look at how do you build the right thing. And he's got a lot of different frameworks, a lot of different terms, customer development, customer discovery. And so in between both of these authors, there's a little bit of a room for what is the playbook of how you incorporate all of the stories written by Eric Ries, but then also a lot of people trying to figure out, how do I use all the curriculum and all the things available from Steve Blank? And so what we've done is we've taken the best of all of this literature and we've put it into a playbook, an easy to remember, really 3-step playbook called the market validation funnel. And that's really what we're going to go over. So the market validation funnel is a playbook for entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs to increase the number of bets, as we talked about. So how do you do that, and making them smaller and faster and learning faster about your customers? So what we're going to do in this quick primer is we're going to go through each of the parts in the funnel, and we're going to describe what they are and the importance to actually going through that process. So the first part in the funnel is really called the minimum viable model. And in this, it's your business model. It's a plan on a page. And so effectively, if you've heard of something called the lean canvas or the business model canvas, it's based off of that. And so what we want to do is create a business model and then model its assumptions. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about assumptions and all of that in a second. But the idea and the core concept is that we want to put all of our idea on a page, make sure we have all of the hypothesis down. A lot of people have these rose-colored glasses on, right? So they have these glasses on and they just can't remove them. They have a hard time looking at their idea objectively. So this is also a way of helping you look at your business idea objectively. So how do you create a minimum viable model? Well, there's 3 steps. And so the 3 steps are business modeling, confidence scoring, and then assumption modeling. So in the first step, we talk about business modeling. Basically what we're doing is we're taking the lean canvas. So the lean canvas was created as a separate idea out of the business model canvas, and it's by an individual called Ash Moria. And so he actually did a great job. He has this website, you can look up Lean Stack. He provides excellent material as well. He did a great job of creating this business model on a page for entrepreneurs. And so we base our minimum viable model off of that. And so as a first structure, but we've added 2 things on top of it. So that leads to the second point, is we use confidence scoring, to where when you have this model, it's effectively adding a confidence score to each part of the business model. And then the third point is after we ask the question why. So with the confidence score, why is it this specific score? And we actually look at what assumptions are we making in the model. And we'll dive in a second and kind of go into more depth. So at a high level, here is the lean canvas. So the lean canvas has all of these different quadrants. It's basically a business model on a page, so you can see at a glance what exactly, when we're talking about your business, what problem is it solving, what solution are you proposing, what's the unique value proposition, etc. So it goes in all different facets of how are you going to find your customers. So the channels, what are your customers? What do those look like? And so it really forces you to dissect each part of your business and make sure you're creating at first a hypothesis. Again, remember, it's a hypothesis. It's not a proven thing. So that first point in this is make sure you go through the lean canvas, put down your business idea. Online, there's a lot of good documentation. In our masterclass, we'll do a walk by walk through this entire canvas. But for the sake of time in this primer, we're just going to give a high level flyover of saying use the lean canvas. So the second thing, again, as I mentioned, is confidence scoring. So with confidence scoring, what we're going to do is we're going to take that same exact canvas and we're going to apply a red, yellow, green score. So in there, what we're going to do is, and how do you judge whether or not it's red, yellow, or green? What we usually say is red. It means your closest friends, your closest colleagues thinks it's a good idea. And so oftentimes I say, if you think your mom says it's a good idea, it's going to be red, because you need to validate. That's not good validation when people closest to you think it's a good idea. Additionally, in large organizations, what I'll say is it is red if your board thinks it's a good idea. And that, I know a lot of people would debate on that, but effectively it's a small group of people that have similar mindsets coming together, all agreeing together on an idea. And really what you want to do is gather a lot more data to understand, are we solving the right problem for the right audience? So it's red effectively if it's your closest friends and colleagues. It's yellow if you've qualitatively validated it. And usually when I say the word qualitative, it means, have you gone out in the market and you've talked to people, right? And you have to talk to at least a certain amount of individuals. Usually that's somewhere between 20, 30 individuals, you've done user interviews, you've done surveys, market research, you maybe even looked at the competitive landscape, right? So you've done some pretty good research on the subject, and you can actually put a line in the sand to say, we are pretty confident. I say pretty confident, which is why it's yellow. We're pretty confident this is the right direction. So if it's qualitatively, and you can prove qualitatively, and you've through interviews and surveys that you're moving in the right direction, move it to yellow. So the last and third one, which you want to strive to, your objective is really, as you look at your business model canvas and you have all of these confidence scores over each of those quadrants, your objective is to move it from red to yellow and yellow to green. And so this last green one is have you quantitatively validated it through market experiments? And we'll talk about what market experiments are, but effectively, it's a way of quantitatively validating it because you have a lot more data points to prove that this part of the model is correct. So at a high level, what your business model ends up looking like, and specifically if you just started a new idea, most of the time it's going to be a big canvas that has a bunch of red confidence scores on it, right? Because initially it's just your hypothesis. You may end up adding some that are yellow because you may have, done some market research, done some interviews, and you've really thought qualitatively about the problem. But for the most part, you're not going to have any green to start. And so it's really important that you put this confidence score, because one of the things that a lot of people do is they create these models, and then once they create the model, they'll shove it in a drawer and say, I'm good, I'm done, I checked it off the list. And so the idea behind the confidence scoring is that you'll treat it more like a dashboard to return back to and a home base to run your business off of, and less like a task to get done. So the last part of this is assumption modeling. And so really the confidence score leads to assumption modeling pretty naturally, because if you can then ask yourself the reason why something is red and why something is yellow, not only because of the qualitative and quantitative nature of have you validated it, but also saying, well, what assumptions are we making within this quadrant? So as an example here, I put an example of something called Uber Things, which is effectively a fake startup that just imagine it as a fake startup that lends items from one thing to another. So imagine someone that has a chainsaw and they want to lend it to someone else, or a tiller, or something that's a large piece of equipment and they want to just rent it because they own it, but someone else wants to rent it from them. So in this example, we're just using Uber Things. And so as we're looking at the assumption modeling for that fake idea, you can see here some example assumptions that you might be making. And really as we go through the masterclass, we talk about the different kinds of assumptions. And so for the purposes of this primer, we're not going to get into that, but effectively there's a core assumption that every business has. And at the top it says people are willing to lend their personal items to strangers. If that wasn't validated, the entire business would not exist and would not be viable. So the idea is that each business has a core assumption you want to try validating as fast as possible, and then they have a set of supporting assumptions. So after that, it's people are willing to rent these items instead of buying them, or there's significant enough demand on either side. So you go through this assumption list, and then your idea is to take those and validate or invalidate those assumptions, which leads us to the next part of the market validation funnel. So the second part of the funnel is really called minimum viable learnings. And so as you have this assumption list and you've generated your model, really we need a way to learn from it, right? We need a way to learn from your customers whether or not an assumption is true. And so what is the minimum thing we need to do to learn, which is why we call it minimum viable learnings. And this often requires two different steps. One is more of a qualitative side, as we talked about, and one is more of a quantitative side. So the qualitative, we talked about some examples of that, is surveys and interviews, and then the quantitative side is market experimentation. So really the steps, as I just mentioned, those two things there's really three different steps within the minimum viable learning. The first step in the minimum viable learning is really research. And so what does research involve? What does that even mean? There's a lot of different facets of research. And Erica Hall, she created a book called Just Enough Research. And she created this great diagram that explains all the different facets of research. So because of the sake of time, again, we're not going to go dive into all the different facets, but needless to say, there is a lot involved in getting qualitative research. So as you can see, there's activities like brand research, competitive analysis, insights, satisfaction, segmentation research. There's a ton of different things you can do to research. And so the biggest ones that we dive more into depth on in the masterclass are surveys, customer interviews, and there's some great material on how to build great customer interview questions as well as design great surveys. So this is the first thing. This is the first thing in qualitative research is what are these different activities to do and what are these different tools to use. So first step, minimum viable learning, again, is research. The second step is market experimentation. And I get a lot of questions on what is market experimentation, and really it's to test different aspects of the business model. And if you think about a market experiment, if you think about just the word alone, experiment, it really comes from a scientific approach of testing a hypothesis, trying to control variables. And in the same way, we design market experiments. We design them in a way that we can get quantitative results out of a specified number of inputs and control groups, and then controlling the number of variables in the experiment itself. So market experimentation is a great way to get quantitative data back on what actually is, if you can validate a piece of the business model, what is that piece? Is it valid? Is it invalid? Is our hypothesis valid? And so we're going to dive a little bit into that in the next slide. So really a market experiment, the reason I'm diving more into depth on this than I am the research side is because not very many people understand. We all know kind of what research means when we say research, but market experiment is maybe a new term for a lot of people. Some characteristics of market experimentation is really they're constructed in days, run in weeks. So there's a minimal viable amount of effort put into these to construct them and run them. They're objective focused, there's measurable outcomes. They're very repeatable. So you can actually repeat them. You can have other team members run the experiments, understand how you ran them. If you were to run them again, you'd get the same results. You have a controlled environment with the controlled variables. And then they're easily be able to tell if you validated or invalidated them. So they're very quantitative, right? So there's a specific hypothesis that you're going to validate or invalidate. So it's not some run the experiment, did it succeed, didn't it? It has very specific success criteria. So some examples of market experiments would be explainer videos. On the right side, you see a bunch of different examples. Explainer videos would be the first one I like to dive into because Dropbox has a great origin story of this. And so how they created Dropbox, which is the file sharing app across all your devices, is they first created a 2-minute explainer video. And it was a new concept, right? Sharing files across devices, across an iPad to a computer to a phone. And so this was a new concept, and it was a lot of engineering effort to put in place. So instead of going out and building it, they said, let's create a 2-minute explainer video to explain what it is, send it out to a target market, and ask for pre-signups. And so they were able to get a large amount of pre-signups very quickly, and they turned around and they actually used that with investors and said, hey, look, we actually have validation in the fact that this is a needed thing. We have all these pre-signups. So great example of a market experiment. Other ones are emailer, shadow button, and I'm going to pick a few just to explain a little bit more. Shadow button, if you have an existing application, put a fake button out there and for a new feature. So if you're designing something new, a new aspect of the system, and they click on it, well, now you can track the number of clicks, and maybe on that next page you have enter your email address if you're interested in the feature, capture the emails, now you have the emails, and so you can actually have proof whether or not you should build something prior to actually building it. And so another great one, which a lot of people use, is landing pages, right? So landing pages, designing a landing page before it is there, the Kickstarter model, having something where you're pushing forward an app or a product and saying, buy my product, and even asking for them to pay for it. A lot of people will even put different pricing models on different screens if you're testing pricing, and being able to test which pricing model is the most effective. So as you can see with market experimentation, what you're trying to drive at is you're trying to put something in place to where you're not just collecting a sample size of 10, 15, 20 different people, but you're trying to get into more of the hundreds, if you're especially in a B2C consumer app. So you're trying to get a lot more quantitative data to say how many people actually want this. So great examples. So the first, again, recapping, we talked about research. The second thing is market experimentation. This is not an exhaustive list of all of the different kinds of experiments, but again, this is a primer course where we'll go in greater depth of all these kinds of experiments in the masterclass itself. So as you can see, there's different components of an experiment like we talked about. There's characteristics, and now the different components are there's writing down what the problem is. What are your assumptions? What do we know from the research part? In order to create and design an experiment effectively, really you should have done some research ahead of time in order to know and craft things that you're trying not to experiment on things that are obvious that you can use just by Googling and trying to figure that out or talking to people. You're trying to find those actions, and really what you want to do is validate what people are saying on the qualitative side through action. And that's really the power of a lot of rapid experimentation. You want a hypothesis that's incredibly important, that's very specific hypothesis with specific numbers that are measurable to determine if it was a success or if it failed. The metrics, writing down the metrics, the plan, the timeline, and then honestly documenting the conclusion. So you want to be able to measure it at certain points in time to see how well it performed over a period of time. And again, we're designing these experiments in a matter of a day or two. So if it's a landing page, we're crafting the landing page in a day or two. And we're not spending weeks, months on something. The idea is how can we learn something very quickly? And that's why it's such a quick turnaround to create something, get out in the market and test it. The last step in doing a minimum viable learning is really, we talked about research, we talked about the experiments. That last part is both of those combined will lead to a set of learnings. And this step, we call it out as a specific step, not just as a result, because of the fact that too many people actually say, great, we've learned, now let's move on to the next one, when they don't take into account of actually putting it into what we call learning inventory. So it's almost like a master brain of all of the learnings you've ever had. And so it's really important, we call that a learning inventory. It's really important to start documenting them and putting them into a learning inventory so that you can recall them later for the purposes of, hey, if you're doing another experiment, you're doing more research, you need to make sure you're not losing track of the things you're learning, because it's too easy, especially when you have multiple team members running experiments and you start running them over a long period of time. You might have hundreds of experiments. You might have hundreds of results and learnings from those. But if you don't document them, you'll end up running experiments and doing market research you've already done before. So this is why this step is especially important. A lot of people ask, what is a learning inventory? Again, take the master class, we go into greater depth, but at a high level, it's a system that just keeps track of all the learnings. So some examples of systems that we've used, Jira is one of them, or a simple spreadsheet, somewhere where you can keep track of what is the learning you learned, how did you learn that, and tying that to the experiment and the research behind that. So you can follow the thread of logic of, oh, here's some research, here's some experiments, here's what we learned out of that. And so having a system to continually do that, and I believe, and our team believes, the future of this is AI, to be able to have a system that you can enter in your learnings and have it recall your learnings from a while ago, so you don't have to sift through hundreds of learnings, is going to be pretty important. And so, but today, having a system that you put your learnings in and you can actually learn from them and use them in the future when you're designing new experiments or you're designing, honestly, new things and features for your customers is pivotally important. So the last step, as we talk about, we just talked about minimum viable model, we talked about minimum viable learning, and now we're going to talk about minimum viable solution. And a lot of people talk about MVP. So for us, we've designed this minimum viable solution, MVS, specifically to be an MVP. That's another kind of synonym. But in a lot of markets, they use MVP as, oh, it's the first version of something. And the way we want to especially define it is a minimum viable solution is a low fidelity, high manual touch version of an MVP. And our thought and our perspective on this is that really it should be a simple thing you can create using popsicle sticks and duct tape to put together very quickly in order to test the market. Too many people spend months and months and months designing these MVPs, especially with a large amount of engineering, taking a lot of money, resources, time to get to market, only to realize what they built is not what the customer actually wanted. And this is why it's so important to use off-the-shelf software, put something together very quickly using a minimum viable solution. So we like to use this analogy. I said duct tape and popsicle sticks. I had baling wire in here. So it's like mashing all those together. And the graphic on the screen here is basically if you have a house and you've got it built out of popsicle sticks, think about that analogy versus laying a foundation of an actual house, putting up studs, putting up actual drywall, putting in something that's a more permanent structure. And the reason for that is, and we'll talk about this, is minimum viable solution really should be something that you can put up really rapidly, learn from, but the purpose would be to tear it down. So as you start to scale, and you need to scale, you'd transition to an actual MVP where you'd probably start engineering something and start building something, but that's after you've really validated using a minimum viable solution in the marketplace. And this is something they actually want and need. So if you look at it another way, I put a Lego house here. The other thing is to look at it like puzzle pieces, right? So if you have all these different puzzle pieces and we talk about low code, no code, that's a great tool to use in constructing a minimum viable solution, like using WordPress and Shopify and any of these other frameworks that are really easily extensible and have a plugin infrastructure or off-the-shelf software. Minimum viable solution is something that you should think about. What's the lowest fidelity thing I can do? And a lot of people even skip over things like Google Docs. We've seen businesses designed at $40,000 a month in revenue. They're generating that amount of money on a Google Sheet. So it's important to stay really low fidelity in order to know and design something that people actually want and need. And then once you achieve that kind of, you're bumping up with scaling problems, then you scale. Far too often as humans, we think we want to especially engineers, want to pre-optimize and pre-think through, oh, we have to scale for thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of users, when really they should be thinking about how do I get my first 10 customers? So 3 steps again, I like to use 3 steps. 3 steps in creating a minimum viable solution. Really, as you're thinking about the idea and you have this solution in mind, the end solution, a lot of people think towards that end point of, hey, it's going to have these features and this thing. Well, what's the most minimum thing you can do? And doing some research in the marketplace for tools that can help you do that. And a lot of times that's evaluating the options, doing some market research on tools themselves. Spreadsheets are a great way to start, something like Airtable, looking at parallel markets. What are some things that are similar than you're trying to accomplish, and see what's out there. The second thing is to actually take all those pieces that you've done research on and assemble them together. And we like to say, think about it in terms of like Legos and some assembly required. Like think in those terms of getting to the 80% mark and getting to good enough, because if you're getting to a target market that desperately wants what you're offering, they're not going to care if it has rough edges because you're solving a true aspirin problem. And the last thing is you should always think about a minimum viable solution. As we talked about market experiments, you should think about it as a larger market experiment. So don't marry yourself to the solution, marry yourself to solving the problem. And really by running a minimum viable solution, it allows you to think in that way. Because if you're thinking this is not a permanent solution, it's only to learn what people want and need, you're going to be designing something that is very rapid, very quick, built for learnings, and you can quickly tweak and pivot as needed. The last thing we like to do is we've got a summary chart of all these different things that we've talked about. Is minimum viable model, talking about the hypothesizing the business model, minimum viable learnings, we've got validate the problem and business model itself, minimum viable solution, it's test the solution, and then you've got a minimum viable product. So we have this chart that kind of walks through questions that a lot of people have is how much money should I spend on this? How much time should I spend creating and running them? And what tools are involved? What people are involved in? All of these questions, that's why we put together this nice summary chart of all of the different aspects of minimum viable model should take 1 to 3 days to create. Minimum viable learnings, create it in 1 to 7 days and really run it in 1 to 2 weeks. So we took this and took it a step further and we try and make all of what we put out actionable against the market validation funnel so that people can look at it and have a playbook. And that's why with the market validation funnel, it's so important to understand that what the idea is behind it is you want to validate things very quickly, learn about your customers, and it's not about jumping forward and building something right away. And so that's why we built this, so that to help entrepreneurs have a playbook to follow and build and scale their startup. Well, thanks for joining me with this primer course. I hope you'll join me for the full masterclass. Go to cityinnovations.com, go to the navigation and click on masterclass. And there you'll find all sorts of more in-depth content, all of the subjects we just kind of breezed over, like research and market experiments, all the different examples of that, you'll find it there. And really our hope and desire is we want your startup to succeed. And we know that 9 out of 10 fail. We want to help you flip that script. So I hope you'll join us there at cityinnovations.com in our masterclass for the full masterclass. Reach out if you have any questions using our contact form. Hope to see you there.